This episode is sponsored by HASA, the trusted choice for liquid chlorine. It's better because it offers the highest purity, works instantly, and contains no added CYA. By the bottom feeder, professional-grade battery-powered swimming pool vacuum system, it sucks to clean pools, so cleaning pools sucks less. And by Skimmer, trusted by over 30,000 pool service pros across North America. Skimmer's software helps you save time, grow revenue, and boost your 5-star reviews. Whether you're just starting out or expanding your team, Skimmer's easy-to-use tools and expert support have you covered. Upgrade your business in 2025 with Skimmer. Visit getskimmer.com/poolguy today.
The Pool Guy Podcast Show. The Pool Guy Podcast Show. The Pool Guy Podcast Show. Yeah!
Hi, and welcome to the Best of the Pool Guy Podcast Show. In this episode, I'm continuing my series on why a pool is not holding chlorine. This is part 2 of a very popular podcast series where I went over in 3 parts why pools aren't holding chlorine, why they're zeroing out, why you struggle maintaining a chlorine level, and I answer some things that maybe are a mystery, or I cover most things that are causing a pool not to hold chlorine. Join my coaching program and take your pool service to the next level. Connect with other pool pros in your area, gain valuable knowledge, and transform your business with personalized one-on-one advice from me. With over 36 years of experience, I'm here to help you succeed like never before. Learn more at poolguycoaching.com. And let me start with that combined chlorine problem. So basically, the combined chlorine is chlorine that's not effective in the pool. And this happens a lot when there's a lot of stuff that interferes with the chlorine. You'll find this a lot in commercial pools, especially when a lot of people are using it. And you'll smell it. It smells almost like ammonia. And the comment you're going to hear a lot is when someone's walking by the pool is, "Oh, I can smell the chlorine. It must be good." And that's kind of the wrong thinking, because chlorine has actually no scent. And if you smell, quote, the chlorine, you're actually smelling the chloramines in the water, which is a byproduct of the pool having combined chlorine. And it's something that could cause the chlorine level to constantly zero out because you have chlorine that's ineffective. And Bob Lowry talked about this, that the chlorine may be below negative as far as getting back to the normal level. I think a good illustration is someone who's maybe recovering from drug addiction, and they've been on drugs for 10 years and they're living in their car, and they finally get into rehab, in the halfway house, and they're getting better, but they're still in negative territory. They're not back to normal yet. I would say they're still negative because they have all the wreckage of what they were doing, and maybe they're not using actively, but they still have all the problems they had that caused the usage. And so they're in a negative territory, and it's going to take a while for them to get back into a normal range and then a positive territory, maybe 2 or 3 years. And this is kind of what happens when you have a pool with a lot of combined chlorine. There's really no way to test for negative chlorine or negative chlorine level, but the combined chlorine is an indicator that you are on a negative end of chlorine, and it may take a large amount of chlorine to break that combined chlorine. In fact, if you do the math and if you use calculators, you'll realize that it's going to take a very large amount to break even a small amount of combined chlorine in the pool. So the chlorine is actually in a negative area that can't be measured. And so you may be adding chlorine to the pool. You may not even be testing for combined chlorine, depending on what you're using to test the pool water with. I think a photometer is the best way to test for combined chlorine. You can use the Lamont Color Q series or the Spin Touch, or you can use the Exact iDip. Any of these will give you a really good combined chlorine. You can use the Pool Lab also. It'll give you a good combined chlorine level that's really accurate. I think reagent testing is fine, but I find the photometer is much more accurate with getting a combined chlorine reading, and test strips are not nearly as accurate as a photometer. Getting the combined chlorine out of the pool, again, takes a lot of effort, and it may be something that you smell noticeably, like the ammonia smell I talked about, or you may not even notice that it's in the pool. You'll just notice that the chlorine is not holding. You can smell, by the way, the ammonia sometimes on people's bathing suits when you're getting out of the pool. You may think that there's something wrong with the reaction of the bathing suit with the pool water, but it's actually the combined chlorine smell staying on the fabric And this is something that is a good indication that there's combined chlorine in the pool. And so if in fact the chlorine is in negative territory, like the drug addict that's getting in the recovery, it's going to take a while to get the pool back to normal. It's going to require a lot of shocking of the water, running the pool longer, cleaning the filter, and just trying your best to keep that chlorine level up and keeping it from zeroing back out. If you take the CPO course, you'll learn about break point, and this is something they talk about a lot because in commercial pools, you're going to run into a lot of combined chlorine. So there's a lot of different formulas, but basically, if you want to break the combined chlorine, you have to put 10 times the amount of free chlorine, or raise it 10 times the amount, I should say, to break the combined chlorine. So let's say, for instance, your photometer shows that you have 0.8 parts per million of combined chlorine. That means that you're going to have to put 8 parts per million of chlorine in the pool and keep it at that level, by the way, all week long until you get to that, until it breaks the combined chlorine. And this may cause you to have to go back to the pool or raise the chlorine level up higher so that it's going to stay up higher the next few days. But sometimes a return visit is important when you're trying to get the break point and break that combined chlorine. And so you have to keep it effectively. If it has a combined chlorine of 0.8 parts per million, you have to effectively keep that pool above 8 parts per million all week long. But there is something to be said about Bob Lowry's formula. I mentioned it in the last podcast, and I'll just briefly touch on it, that the cyanuric acid should be 7.5. Your free chlorine should be 7.5% of the cyanuric acid level in the pool. So if we're taking this example here, and you have the combined chlorine of 0.8 parts per million, and you want to raise the chlorine to 8 parts per million. However, the cyanuric acid in the pool is at 150 parts per million. You're actually going to need a lot more free chlorine in the pool to counter the high cyanuric acid and to reach the break point of the combined chlorine. So sometimes when you're trying to break the combined chlorine in the pool and you're using this formula, you're not accounting for cyanuric acid being higher than 80 parts per million, or actually higher than 100 parts per million, because at 100 parts per million, 8 parts per million would still be okay in this pool. But if you had a pool with a cyanuric acid level of 150 parts per million or 200 parts per million, you would need a lot more chlorine in that pool to break the combined chlorine. And this may be one reason why it's not breaking. And so the cyanuric acid level is something that you should consider when you're trying to reach the break point, chlorination point in the pool. And if you're not counting for the cyanuric acid, you may not be putting enough chlorine in the pool to break the combined chlorine. So that's a factor that you should consider. And this is something I addressed in the last podcast when I was talking about a high cyanuric acid level affecting the ability of the chlorine to work in the pool. Again, I can just do the math for you here easily so you have it updated in this podcast. But if you had a cyanuric acid of 150 parts per million and you times it by 7.5%, that means that you would need a chlorine level of 11 parts per million just to maintain the chlorine in the pool and make it effective. And if there's combined chlorine and the break point is 8 parts per million based on that formula I just gave you earlier, your 8 parts per million won't do it because you're going to need 11 parts per million just to make the chlorine effective in that pool. So you may need something around 20 parts per million to break that combined chlorine in that pool. That's why the breakpoint formula isn't always successful or accurate, because in a pool with high cyanuric acid, that really doesn't mean much because the chlorine in the pool won't be effective unless it's 7.5% of the cyanuric acid level to begin with. And just like the last podcast where I would give you a common problem and an uncommon one, here's one that you don't really come in contact with or think about much. But if there's iron in the pool water, this will actually zero out the chlorine. So this is something to consider when you're trying to get a pool back and you're testing everything. You're testing the nitrates, like I mentioned in the last podcast. You're testing the cyanuric acid level. Everything seems to be checking out fine. There's no nitrate. The cyanuric acid level is fine. Let's say it's at 70 parts per million. But you're adding chlorine like crazy and it's not holding. Then I would say do an iron test to see if there's iron in the water. If there's iron in the water, this will definitely cause the chlorine to zero out. And this is something to consider and to check. And I think this is something that a lot of people don't check because they don't have any test kit that will check for iron. Good news is that there are iron test strips. Even better news is that there are photometers that will check the iron level in the pool, like the Color Q 2X Pro 9. The exact eye dip also checks for iron. The spin touch will check for iron, but checking your pool for copper and iron are important. Copper, not so much affecting the chlorine level, but the iron in the water will cause the chlorine level to zero out. How do you get rid of the iron? You're going to use sequestering agents. You can use Jack's Magic, and then you're going to put a Sealator 4.0 in the pump basket and leave it in the pool for about 2 months, running the pool as much as you can. And a sequestering agent will suspend the metal, and the Sealator 4.0 will extract the metal and take it out of the pool. There's no other way to remove the iron from the water unless you're going to drain the water, but the Sealator is definitely an effective way to remove the iron from the pool water. Let me touch really quickly on the saltwater generator. If you have a saltwater generator and you're running it and it's not holding chlorine, there can be a number of reasons. This is probably, I could do a separate podcast on this, but I'll just touch briefly on it so that I kind of cover everything here. If you have a saltwater generator and you're noticing that the chlorine's zeroing out every day or every week, the problem may be twofold. Number one, you may not have enough cyanuric acid in the water. Since you're not adding tablets or any cyanuric acid in any form, it may be too low. So check the cyanuric acid. Make sure that you're at 50 to 80 parts per million of cyanuric acid for it to hold chlorine effectively. Number two, you may not be running the pool long enough for it to produce enough chlorine. If you look at the literature by the manufacturer, the chlorine production numbers are based on a full speed, single speed pump running at 3450 RPMs, running for 24 hours a day. So the 1.2 pounds of chlorine is being produced only if it's running for 24 hours a day. And by the way, this is a good way to test if the saltwater system is working. Just run your pool at full speed for 24 hours a day and see how much chlorine it produces. And this is a way to test to make sure that the cell is working. I do the 24-hour test a lot out there, and it's a way for me to see if the cell is actually working. And this is something that you may have to check, with the manufacturer. There's different voltage, and the cell may not be working. And of course, if the water's cold, it's not going to work effectively. That's another reason why in the wintertime you want to switch over to liquid chlorine, because the cold water does not conduct electricity well, and the saltwater systems will turn off. Most of them will indicate when the water is too cold to operate with a red light, or it's going to say cold or something on the display. So you definitely want to make sure that the water temperature is high enough for it to operate. And then the salt level is really important. Most salt systems will indicate low salt in some way, maybe a red light saying it's low salt, or it'll say low salt on the display. If there's not enough salt in the water, it's not going to be able to produce the chlorine effectively. So the salinity level or salt level is really important. Most salt systems will work at 3,000 parts per million to 4,000 parts per million, depending on the system. So you want to make sure that you test the salt to make sure there's enough salt in the water. And a good way to test it is with a digital salinity meter. And this will give you an accurate reading of how much salt is in the water. And of course, another reason why the salt system may not be working is there may be calcium on the plates. So make sure you take the cell off if there's no clear glass to look through, and inspect the plates on the cell to make sure that they're free of calcium, because this will also affect the production of the chlorine in the pool, or producing chlorine in the pool, and it won't produce chlorine nearly as effectively if the cell plates are dirty. So definitely you want to really check out your saltwater system to make sure, number one, you're running the pool long enough at the right RPM. And sometimes if you're running it at a really low RPM, let's say 1900 RPMs or 1800 RPMs for 10 hours a day, and then you have the medium speed on for a couple hours, it may not have enough circulation going through the salt system to produce enough chlorine for your pool, depending on the pool size. You may have an undersized cell also. This happens a lot out there. I've seen builders put in an IC20 in a pool that's 25,000 gallons, and it's not going to be able to produce nearly enough chlorine in a bigger pool. So the size of the salt cell is important, making sure that there's no red lights. Usually the red light indicates something bad on the salt system. So make sure there's no red lights indicating the cell's dirty, that the salt level is too low, and you definitely want to run the pool a long time. One thing that you may not notice with the salt system is the flow meter. I know a lot of times on the Hayward systems, rodents will chew the wire. Sometimes they'll snap, if someone's by the equipment, they'll hit the wire and snap the flow sensor. So make sure that the flow sensor is not red on the Aquarite systems or the Hayward systems. Other ones have more or less built-in flow sensors, but they can fail also. Pentair had a run of failed flow sensors on their IntelliChlor and their iChlor systems. So if you're seeing a red light or no flow, that could indicate that you have a bad flow sensor. And in that case, the saltwater system is not going to produce any chlorine because it's thinking that there's no water flowing through the cell. So it'll shut down and not work. So there are some things that can go wrong with the system itself. And just be aware of your salt system. Read the manual. See all the things you have to do to maintain it. They're actually really easy to maintain, but there are problems that you run into where the saltwater generator is not producing chlorine. The number one problem that I see is that the customers don't run their pool long enough for it to produce enough chlorine for the pool. Again, numbers from the manufacturer when it says it makes 1.2 pounds of chlorine is a single speed pump running at 3450 RPMs 24 hours a day. And so if you're having problems with the pool holding chlorine, the cyanuric acid level is in the right range, but it's still zeroing out on you, it may just be something as simple as increasing the runtime and, of course, the output of the salt cell. This is something that's also important. I've been to many accounts where it's just not producing chlorine because they had the salt output down really low on their salt system. And as an example, the way the output works is that if you have it at 40%, that means that in an hour, the salt system will come on 40% of that time, and then 60% of the time is going to be off, and that's kind of how it controls the output. It doesn't really regulate it by, releasing chlorine, at a lower percentage. It's basically, it's going to run for a certain time producing chlorine, and it's going to not run producing chlorine. And that's why when you hit the superchlorinate or boost button on the salt system, it'll actually raise the production or the output to 100%. So if you have it set at 50%, that means that in that 1 hour period, for 30 minutes, the salt system is not working or running. And for the other 30 minutes, it's producing chlorine. And so having the output set at 100%, and I should have said this when I do the 24-hour test, you run the pool at the full speed with the output at 100%. And just to clarify that, in 24 hours, if the manufacturer says you'll have 1.2 pounds of chlorine, of course you can't measure that, but you can measure the chlorine part per million very accurately with the right tester. So if you're at 0 and you're running that salt system for 24 hours at 3450 RPMs, at 100% output, all the lights are green on the system, you should get a really good chlorine reading, I would say, and depending on the pool size, at least 5 parts per million to 10 parts per million in that 24-hour period. If you're putting in 1.2 pounds of chlorine in the pool and you have the right size salt system. So the salt systems can be a little tricky, and you may have a pool that zeroes out for a number of reasons because the salt system is not running correctly or set correctly. So that covers some more here. And I'll probably do another part here because there are some other things that I didn't cover in these first 2 parts. So stay tuned and I'll continue why a pool may not be holding chlorine. If you're looking for other podcasts, you can find those on my website, swimmingprolearning.com. On the banner, click on the podcast icon. That'll take you to a drop-down menu over 1,500 podcasts that I have recorded. And if you're interested in the coaching program that I offer, you can learn more about the coaching program at poolguycoaching.com. Thanks for listening to this podcast. Have a great rest of your week, and God bless. This episode is brought to you by HASA, providing products that deliver clean, healthy water for every aspect of everyday life. The bottom feeder battery-powered vacuum system, portable, powerful, and only weighs 12 pounds. And Skimmer. Get Skimmer, America's #1 pool service software. Podcast listeners can try Skimmer for free at getskimmer.com/poolguy.